We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. The U.S. presidential election appears to be neck and neck. Many are predicting a Trump victory. What would a next Trump administration look like? The Democrats are arguing, and some on the left are arguing, that this election is a fight between fascism and freedom, between tyranny and democracy. Welcome to the Socialist program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an author. He's a political activist. He's the co-host of the Freedom Side Live, a live video show every Thursday at 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time here at Breakthrough News. Eugene, welcome back.
Brian, thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you. Eugene, elections sometimes do matter. Of course, we had the election of 1860. That prompted the U.S. Civil War and ultimately the end of slavery in the United States, at least except for those who are incarcerated. The election of 1800 was a very important election. Again, we don't want to minimize the impact or importance of elections. In fact, 2016 was an important election, I would say. But this presentation by the Democratic Party that if Trump wins, it's sort of the end of democracy. And it begs the question, let's talk about definitions and categories. Is Trump a fascist? Will a Trump administration be a fascist administration? Are the Democrats right that this is a battle between democracy and authoritarianism? I mean, some of this is echoed in the U.S. left. For a long time, left parties, including parties that consider themselves Marxists, say the main goal is to stop the advent of the right. In fact, since 1936, some of the leading left parties have been saying, you've got to vote for the Democrats. Otherwise, if the Republicans come in, it's kind of the end of democracy. In my own lifetime, I've heard this over and over again. Anyway, I think this is a false juxtaposition. We need to understand what fascism is, but it's not simply democracy equals freedom, fascism equals violence. Anyway, I want to get your take before we get started.
No, I think it's a great point. And, you know, from just like a tactical perspective, you know, the lesser of two evils thing, I mean, you know, let's just go a little bit, you know, closer in history. 1980, Reagan comes in, and from then to now, the political system has shifted even more to the right. And as I'm sure you remember well, I mean, people were talking about Reagan the way they talk about Trump, and now we have Democratic Party candidates bragging about how much they are like Reagan and how the Republicans need to return to the party of Reagan and how there was this like mythical Republican Party that allegedly involves, you know, even Dick Cheney, one of the most right-wing figures in U.S. politics whose political rise came under the far-right Nixon administration, who then was the vice president in the George W. Bush administration. Like, this is where we are. So the whole idea that voting for the Democrats is somehow going to prevent the rise of the far right is just completely and totally disproven by the actual events that took place, which was, of course, the multiple elections of Reagan, George H.W. Bush, the right-wing administration of Bill Clinton. That, by the way, was the first administration to really go super hard on this tough on the border thing for the past 50 years or so prior to his election there in 1992, and on and on and on we can go. But I think the point you're making is a great point, and I think we have to understand, you know, sort of what we call like democracy, bourgeois liberal democracy in an important way. Because ultimately, when you have the bourgeois revolutions that happen across the Atlantic basin, you know, in which the American Revolution was a part, is you had a certain subset of the rising capitalist class that was trying to establish the rights of the individual in contradistinction to the divine right of kings, to be able to establish their right to control their own property, right? That's why John Locke said one of the most important things was life, liberty, and property. Their ability to control their own property and to keep the king from being able to meddle in, their ill-gotten riches and their desire to also have more influence politically in the society, as it were, right? But the founders of the United States, the Democrats, quote unquote, you could say, in places like the United Kingdom and France and others, they were 100% aware of the fact that there was a bit of a contradiction here. And when you look at the Constitutional Convention here in the United States and the conversation in the ratification conventions, the one thing that becomes very clear is that very, very openly, the founding fathers were saying that they wanted to make sure that there wasn't actually much of a democracy, right? Like they were speaking based on Republican principles, the rights of individuals, liberty, and so on and so forth. But as Madison said in the famous Federalist Paper 10, and as many others said, they had to, and I'm just paraphrasing here, people just have to go back and look for it, but the famous thing about factions they make you read in civics class, he said the most durable faction was between rich and poor, and the most important factor of how you set up legislation and a structure of government was essentially to make sure that rich people could rule over poor people. And that is more or less what we see we saw in the United Kingdom, what we saw in France, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, what took place in the wake of that was these forms of sort of managed democracies, where there is just enough democracy to be able to sort of define the individual rights that are absolutely crucial for capitalism to be the ruling system, but to try to limit it as much as possible. And almost every major democratic gain that's been made in most of the sort of global North democratic countries are gains that have come from the broad masses of people struggling for their rights and really clawing them away, often having to wade through rivers of blood to convince the ruling class to give some level of concession. So when we look at Trump and we look at all this issue, I think what we have to recognize is that this is actually the real status quo of capitalism, to have the least amount of rights and the least amount of democracy that is possible at any given moment. Now, for most of the moments, they've had to find some level of concessions, right? I mean, you could have a Jim Crow fascist dictatorship in the South in the United States, but then there were differing levels and different types of suffrage. Up until 1918 in the United Kingdom, many men, actually about 1918, 40% could not vote because there were property requirements. So there've always been attempts to do this. There's been extreme violence. I already mentioned Jim Crow. You can think about the colonialism of these different places. You can think about the brutal suppression of strikes that have gone on. You can think about the anti-socialist laws that exist. We see the Ku Klux Klan here in the 1920s was one of the largest civic and political organizations in America, and presidents like Woodrow Wilson were in fact people who had a Ku Klux Klan style ideology, but you couldn't do everything you wanted to do because you had to have some real democracy and some veneer of democracy. And then you have Mussolini and Hitler, who wanted to take it to an even greater degree and saying, not only do we not need any real democracy, we don't even need the veneer of democracy, and we're going to go with a just total, autocratic, non-democratic system, one that sort of, doesn't even speak to this, and we don't need it, and so on and so forth. That didn't really work out. So you get to our sort of present day situation, and we have a similar reality where I think similar to Mussolini and Hitler in this sense, you have a rising subset of the ruling elites in the United States, just like in Italy and Germany, that are really starting to question whether or not they can push forward a capitalist agenda that will restore their profit rates under democracy, because it would be so destructive that it would, provoke a huge backlash. So what can they do to kind of limit democracy in a way that hasn't been seen in 40 or 50 years? But they're not, in my view, and what we see, I mean, there's some of them, the Peter Thiels of the world, but the broader Trump movement is not saying, like Hitler and Mussolini, let's end democracy, but they're certainly saying, let's curtail it and let's bring back some of the most odious authoritarian features of quote-unquote democracy that were mainly defeated by the New Deal, by the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, and so on and so forth, so that we can better control society to implement our agenda. So it's still deeply dangerous, problematic, and something that people should be concerned about and standing up to. But the voting for the Democrats is not going to help us, because that's how we got here. I mean, again, and Reagan, they said he was just, he was a fascist. All these things that they said then, they're saying now, but somehow voting for lesser of two evils since 1980, we have Trump. So A, voting for the Democrats is not going to help us, and B, trying to make this hard and fast division between fascism and democracy, we actually sort of lose the essence of how undemocratic capitalism is, how extremely violent most capitalist governments have been over many years, how aggressively there has been pushback to that, which has gained democratic rights, but how whenever there's an opportunity to roll them back, you see the elites try to roll them back as much as possible. And understanding the continuum of capitalist rule in which fascism exists in is critical for us to understand how to defeat it, which is actually socialism.
Yeah, I think that's the way to present it for people, that it's not democracy versus fascism. It's really capitalism versus socialism. I mean, capitalism has ruled, Eugene. You talked about the across the Atlantic basin, the revolutions, including the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the revolutions for for independence of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Latin America, the Revolution of 1830 in France, 1848, the European-wide revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871. This whole period of revolutions, it had to do with the rights of property owners, the rights of elites who were not the king, not the queen, not the monarchy, to have a say in modern society as it evolved into capitalism. And you can see that at times the working class and bourgeois forces fought together, but at critical junctures, the bourgeoisie in all of these places, certainly after the French Revolution, always came down on the side of supporting reaction. In fact, the old ruling class, in fact, the dynasties, the kings and queens, rather than extend the franchise to the working class, because they really feared the working class more than anything. Now, when you think about modern-day fascism in Italy, first with Mussolini, or Germany, the United States government in the beginning of the rise of Hitler, they didn't look unfavorably. Big parts of the ruling class were very sympathetic to Hitler. Eventually, when Germany and the U.S. went to war against each other starting in 1941, December 1941, that changed. But there were lots of bourgeois figures who idolized Hitler. And in fact, when we think about how Hitler came to power, people should also remember this. It wasn't like the Nazis seized power in some sort of Nazi revolution. The bourgeois forces in Germany, who had originally been anti-Nazi, who considered it a plebeian, ugly mess, they brought Hitler into power. It was Hindenburg, the bourgeois leadership, that actually brought the fascists into power. And I think it's important because when people make this false dichotomy, we're fighting democracy versus fascism, and drop the class equation out, drop the equation of what the capitalists are after, you lose the meaning of all of this. Like now the Democrats love George W. Bush. Now they love Dick Cheney and his daughter, Liz Cheney, General, the Chief of Staff,
Kelly.
John Kelly. He says, well, Trump is a fascist. I've read the books, and according to my definition, he's a fascist. Well, who are these people? Again, it's not fascism versus democracy as if the capitalists are sort of addicted to democracy and it's just this fringe group that's for fascism. In fact, the two go hand in hand.
No, I think it's a great point. Kelly's entire presentation, he's also the one, of course, who surfaced this, at least alleged quote. Of course, Trump is denying this, that he said he needed generals like Hitler, which is certainly alarming. But when you look at Kelly's thing, he said, well, and I asked him, you mean Bismarck's generals, right? And he said, no, I mean Hitler's generals. And that sort of implication there is like if he said Bismarck's generals, it would be okay. But I mean, this is Otto von Bismarck, the head of the German Empire, who, among other things, set up the Berlin Conference, which unleashed the scramble for Africa. And by the way, the Berlin Conference, which was set up at the behest of Leopold II of Belgium. So we're talking about two people, Leopold II, who presided over the Holocaust for sure, as many as 10 million people people killed in the Congo. Otto von Bismarck, who set up the agenda for the broad scramble for Africa and the just unbelievable atrocities of colonialism, but who also, his generals, who ultimately were the ones who went and colonized so-called German Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, who committed their own genocide of the Herero and Nama people. So it's sort of just, it just shows how, I don't really know John Kelly. I don't know if he knows this, if he doesn't know this, if he agrees or whatever, but it shows the paucity of the liberal discourse. And it speaks exactly to the point you're making of not separating the two, that he'd be like, well, listen, it was terrible that he said Hitler's generals, but like, who cares if he said Bismarck's generals, despite the fact that Bismarck was one of the worst colonialists who facilitated some of the worst atrocities and genocides across the African continent. And also, just for the record, generally was not that favorable to democracy, put in the anti-socialist laws to try to destroy the Socialist Party, called them actually rats that needed to be exterminated, tried to eliminate through the culture count the Catholic parties. They were also right-wing, but just shows you the general sort of gist of it. And I think it shows how shallow this liberal discourse really is. And I think you make another really important point. I mean, because not only were there favorable people to Hitler in America, I mean, Henry Ford was one of Hitler's earliest funders, by the way, and helped him rise. Charles Lindbergh, of course, a noted follower of Hitler, but Hitler also had a lot of admiration for America. And part of it is because even though, he was looking to move further than America had gone. I mean, obviously, America had the Jim Crow dictatorship. You had the extreme restriction of citizenship rights of people coming from Asia, so on and so forth. But you still had what you might call a veneer of democracy, but I wouldn't just call it a veneer, because some of it was more real, because people had fought for the right to vote, to have more impact, so on and so forth. But Hitler still was thinking, okay, if I'm going to bring in this sort of extreme authoritarian capitalist regime, then who can I look to for examples? And it's like, well, the United States. I mean, not only the long history going back to the founding fathers, but what they were doing, right at that moment was something that he thought could be used. And when we look at sort of how Trump is being promoted, I think it's so interesting to me that people keep comparing Trump to Hitler, when a lot of what Trump is saying is as American as apple pie. I mean, the Insurrection Act, which is what he has said he's going to use to bring the military into the streets, of course, was created to bring together the militias, to suppress the Native Americans who were resisting their own genocide, and also the sort of popular classes of the United States that were rising up against the rich and what was then the West in many parts of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. The Enemy Aliens Act, which he says he's going to use to deport all these people. Well, that comes from the broader Alien and Sedition Act, which was all about the reality of how the elites were worried that the spirit of the French Revolution would infect America and wanted to crack down on people. His mentors, Roy Cohn, the attorney for Joseph McCarthy, which was really just an extension of the J. Edgar Hoover machine that was against unions, any rights for black people, any significant progressivism of any kind, and using basically whatever methods, underhanded or not, to prevent any opposition to the ruling elite really emerging in America. So, the soil that Trump is emerging from is, really American, not German. And there's certainly corollaries between them. But again, this is why we have to not separate the two questions. I think it's very fair to say there is an exceptionalism that exists when we talk about Italy and Germany, for sure. There is no doubt that Hitler and Mussolini tried to switch things into a modality where the sort of managed democracy by elites that had emerged in the 18th century just turned into basically no rights for anyone, and just a clique of capitalists and a clique of Nazi party and other leaders who would kind of run everything with no real input from anyone else. But that's exceptional in some ways, but it's not exceptional in other ways, including the use of extreme violence, including trying to find a way to limit people's democratic rights, all these different and varying factors. So we don't want to put an equal sign between them, but we have to understand the relationship between them, mostly really rooted in one basic fact, and I'll just close on this issue here, which is that capitalism is an unsustainable system in many ways for the vast majority of people. And to maintain a system that is incredibly unequal and mainly exploits and oppresses people, sometimes you can't buy them off. Sometimes you can't co-opt them. Sometimes you can't include them in the system. And in those moments, you go to try to smash all opposition. And in the midst and the depths of the Depression, especially in Germany that we're talking about here, that was the move that was made. When Hitler brings in all the industrialists, that's what he tells them. You guys aren't going to have a lot of input into how how we run things, but the thing you really want, which is to crush all unions, all socialists, all communists, and make sure that you have untrammeled profits, we are going to do that for you. Do you agree? And they said yes, and they all started supporting him in a major, major way. So we have to understand the emergence of Trump, which is not, it has fascist forces in his coalition, I think, but it isn't trying to end democracy in a way that Hitler and Mussolini was, but it is trying to restrict it in a way that it hasn't been for some time. But the root of it is basically the same. The attempt of capitalist elites to impose a system on the masses of people who don't want to accept that way of living. And it can't be done under a democracy as we have it right now, which was expanded by the civil rights movement especially, but also the labor movement, because it gives too many rights to people. So you got to pull it back down. And I think that is dangerous, and we shouldn't underplay it. But to call it fascist, it, to me, is a misnomer of where we are.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think when you think about what actually happened in fascist Germany, after the bourgeoisie, again, invited Hitler to take the reins of governmental power, was the liquidation of a very robust communist movement. It was the liquidation of a robust socialist movement, the liquidation of an emerging, nascent women's movement, and even gay rights movement. Germany was the land of Marx and Engels. It was the most progressive ideologically, politically. The German socialists had 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag, in the parliament in 1910. That was the biggest party. After Bismarck's anti-socialist laws were lifted, the left took off in Germany. So it was very significant. We don't want to minimize it and say just because capitalism functions through these various forms of government that the various forms don't matter and that all that matters is capitalism. I mean, again, you can have capitalists ruling through a monarchy. You can have, like in Saudi Arabia, you can have capitalism ruling through a theocracy like Israel. You can have capitalism operating through a democratic republic, so-called, like the United States, where there are competing bourgeois ruling class parties. You can have military dictatorships, like what happened after the overthrow of Pinochet in Chile in 1973. There are many forms of governance, and they matter. It's not like Marxists or socialists don't care and just say, oh, it's about capitalism and socialism. No, it does matter. It matters a lot if workers have civil rights and civil liberties, like whether you can have a meeting, a mass meeting, go out and petition. In the case of, say, the Party for Socialism and Liberation's candidates, Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia, the fact that they can campaign openly, that matters. It's not like it doesn't matter. But if we think about the struggle between different factions of the capitalists without understanding the class basis of these struggles, intra-class struggles within the elites, and also how do you fight the right and how do you remedy it? Because one wing of the bourgeoisie, the Democrats in this case, are not, as you pointed out in the beginning, the solution to fighting the right. Again, George Washington and the people who led the U.S. American War of Independence, their slogan was no taxation without representation. They weren't talking about the enslaved people. They weren't talking about working people. They weren't talking about farmers. They were talking about themselves. They were the only ones at that time who were actually paying taxes. So we just have to have a deeper class understanding of these topics. And again, it does matter, but the solution, and that's what I want to talk with you about even more, the solution to the right and to the organic tendency of capitalism to move in an authoritarian, totalitarian, or fascist direction, the solution is not tying your kite to another wing of the ruling class, because they don't fight. They have similar things in common with each other. Now, I want to go back before we get to what actually happened under Trump, and I want to talk about that, and what Make America Great Again actually means. I want to talk about that. But I want to go back to this issue that you hit upon about the American bourgeoisie's collaboration with German fascism. I mean, if you think about it, it's the George Bush family. You have, of course, Ford, who's written about in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. You have General Motors, Alcoa Aluminum, finance. All of Germans, the rearming of Germany happened with Alcoa Aluminum and General Motors and Standard Oil. The Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, they were open Nazi sympathizers. Their law firm in New York, Cromwell and Simon, or Simon and Cromwell, they facilitated 70% of industrial investment in Germany. These guys the Kennedys, these guys only turned against Nazism when the U.S. and Germany actually went to war. So it became an inter-imperialist conflict, but they admired Hitler's ability to destroy the left. That's what they liked about it. And we talk about Trump at Madison Square Garden last week, and I have a clip I'm going to play from that. Well, there was a pro-Nazi garden event in 1939, and it was completely filled up, and it wasn't treated badly by the mainstream media. Anyway, let's talk about this a little bit.
No, I think it's a critically important point. And I mean, you had sort of Father Coughlin and these other people trying to build mass movements around it, the Silver Shirts, the Liberty League. I mean, all of these extreme right-wing people. And again, I think the point you're making is these people admired Hitler because he was able to do what they were not actually able to achieve, which was to totally crush the left, totally crush the labor movement, and, push this sort of untrammeled capitalist agenda. I mean, obviously we also had the, even attempted coup against Roosevelt that took place that, of course, Smedley Butler talked about to such a degree that was, designed to more or less copy what Mussolini had done, particularly in Italy, in terms of the March to Rome and so on and so forth. So, this was a deep tendency, and it was also one in the United Kingdom, the so-called Cliveden set, that was very pro-Hitler, by the way, and also included, the former king who had abdicated for, his wife. But it just gives you a sense it had even gotten into the royal family in that regard. I mean, you see in basically every single Western European country, very significant. Like, that's why the Nazis took over so quickly. I mean, the way we talk about it now, people are like, oh, they couldn't fight the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, blah, 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 the Norwegians. I mean, one, false. I mean, and just look at how a lot of them did fight in partisan units and resistance units throughout the entirety of World War II. Right, but the reason the countries fell right away is a huge section of the ruling class were like, yeah, we're basically with Hitler. So let's just, rather than fight a war, let's just go with it. It all makes sense to us. Like, in the context of where we are, the economy is so far down in the Depression. We might as well, in order to stay rich and keep ourselves in the position we want to be in, the easiest way to do that is to suppress all opposition. And I think that's a really critical and important point to understand for a number of different reasons. But I think it also speaks to, where we are now. And I think some of the precedents that are out there. I mean, in a way, why was it that when you look at where we are right now, and when you look at the sort of issue and the point you made about the differences between the bourgeoisie and the inner elite conflicts and how it led to the rise of fascism, I mean, in the United States, you were able to build a powerful left-wing movement based on the trade unions that was able to create a different type of coalition that was able to push back against the fascists. But ultimately, it was sort of a social democratic left coalition that also included communists that was presenting a very different view of how to respond to the challenges that existed in the Depression. And if you look at what took place in Germany, I won't go in a long rant here. I mean, in some ways, this is how the Nazis succeeded, is the left remained extremely divided. Now, there's obviously a lot of big debates around that, who is right, who is wrong, but what's important to understand here is that the left remained divided, so there was no clear left-wing alternative. You had the Social Democrats who were blocking with many right-wing parties, including Hindenburg, including the Center Party and others, to try to keep the Nazis out. But because they were trying to build this broad anti-Nazi alliance, similar to the Democrats today, the rhetoric, the agenda was actually trying to co-opt a lot of the right wing, so the center of gravity politically kept shifting to the right wing, and the challenges being faced by working class people, middle class people, the petty bourgeoisie in Germany were actually never resolved, which meant the Nazis got more and more powerful because they were like, we're going to cut the Gordian knot. We're going to come through here and slice through it all and solve all your problems. Now, on the other hand, you had the communists who also were aggressively fighting the Nazis on the streets everywhere they could, opposing them. But they didn't quite take the Nazis that seriously. They thought it was sort of a ruling class game, and that the ruling class was totally in control of Hitler, and that ultimately, they would never really sort of come to power. So they were also either way, both sides were kind of talking past each other on the left, and they never really were able to connect. And thus, you were able to divide the working class forces in a way that made it possible for the Nazis to sort of slip through the breach and do this. And this was the agenda of the capitalist class in Germany. And I think it's important for where we are right now to compare those two moments, because if Trump is a fascist, and if he is elected, that will be the immediate invocation of like the Nuremberg laws, American style 2025, then, the game is already up. But if this is still a dynamic political moment where certainly we still have agency and organization, where the entirety of the ruling class is not in fact convinced that we need to move in a pure sort of exceptionalist fascist direction, where the ruling class is divided, they're unified on wanting to apply much more repressive force, right? Like that's what cop cities are about. That's what anti-pipelines are about. But they're still divided on how to exactly implement that agenda in a certain way. And where the broad masses of people are saying they want to see radical change to many elements of society, but particularly the economy. And it's showing up again and again in multiple polls. We've had a series of uprisings that are going on. If we can create an alternative that brings together people who know capitalism is the problem, socialism is the cure, and present this as a direct alternative to all capitalist programs, we have the ability to start to shift the center of gravity back to the left, rather than just playing to the tune of the far right, which is what the Democrats are doing right now. So understanding both the continuum of sort of violence and anti-democratic reality in capitalism, and the exceptionalism of how fascism came to be, why it came to be, the divisions between the elites, and how we, with our own working class, oppressed and exploited unity, can exploit that. We can seize an opportunity. But the Democrats are trying to prevent a mass movement from emerging. They're trying to demobilize the masses of people by saying that this is just fascism. There's nothing you can do. Everything will be, you'll be executed in the street if you don't vote for Kamala Harris the very next day. We'll never have any other elections. I mean, I even heard someone on CNN say yesterday that saying Kamala's name wrong is fascism. So, I mean, they're going to such an insane degree here because they understand that the actual way to fight back is to build a broad left-wing mass movement rooted in popular mobilization. And that's the opposite of what the leadership of the Democratic Party, which is all billionaires, want. So they're trying to prevent that from emerging by lying about the stage we're in and demobilizing people and having them invest their hopes only in the Democratic Party leadership.
Let's stay with this theme. On June 1st, 2020, Donald Trump stood in front of St. John's Church in Washington, D.C. with a Bible. I think we have an image or a footage of that. He was there because the police, the federal police, the Park Police, the D.C. police had just cleared Lafayette Park. They used pepper spray. They used tear gas. They were declaring war against the people who were protesting the murder of George Floyd in Washington, D.C. And right before he came across the park and stood in front of the church with the Bible, he had a conference call with all the governors, including Tim Walz, who was then governor of Minnesota. And he praised Tim Walz for using strong military force against the people who were in the streets in Minneapolis and other parts of Minnesota who were protesting against the murder of George Floyd. And he insisted that the U.S. government was going to use the military against the cities. I think Mark Esper said we have to dominate the enemy domain or something like that, meaning American cities. They were using very militaristic, fascistic language about what they were going to do. Now, just remember, not you, Eugene, but for the audience, George Floyd was killed on May 25th, murdered. Everybody watched it. The disgusting murder of George Floyd provoked big demonstrations in Minneapolis and then a rebellion in Minneapolis. And then there were protests all around the country, including Washington, D.C. I was at them in Washington, D.C. the days right before June 1st. And the police were tear gassing people, and people were at first running away from the tear gas, and then they started hurling the tear gas back. In other words, people started becoming braver and braver and fighting back in resistance. It was like all the hallmarks of rebellion, similar to the many, many rebellions that have been a permanent, not a permanent, but a regular feature of contemporary life, especially in oppressed communities, especially in Black America. And so this was starting to take off. So Trump said, we're going to use the Insurrection Act. We're going to use the military against American cities. And he made this like symbolic thing. We're going to come across Lafayette Park. We're going to clear these demonstrators out. We're going to use extreme violence. And then I'm going to show I'm the God-fearing president, which is a joke too. And he's going to hold the Bible. But this was to inaugurate like a massive kind of fascist-like crackdown. Now, the next day, Eugene, as we all remember, in the days right afterwards, instead of people being cowed by that, masses of people took to the streets in even larger numbers and even more militant protests. And Trump's effort to impose this kind of martial law on America was defeated by the 35 million Americans, Black and Latino and Asian and Arab and Native and white people who came together to say no to all of this. That was how Trump's attempt to impose a kind of fascism on America was defeated. It wasn't the Democrats. Tim Walz and the others were collaborating. Same with the Washington, D.C. mayor, collaborating. It was the people, the grassroots. I think it's such an epic example of how you actually successfully fight the right. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think it's critically important on so many points. I mean, and first and foremost, just to remind people again, you know, Trump invoking the Insurrection Act and putting the military on the streets, which we're told is like, this is, you know, Hitler. Well, I have to be honest, that's America. And we have to recognize these are American laws. And we haven't heard one peep from the Harris-Walz campaign to say, repeal the Insurrection Act, repeal the Alien Enemies Act. I mean, if they're so concerned, how come they didn't try to change the law to prevent Trump from being able to do this? They keep saying they're so concerned. Trump's going to use the military on the street. You should be so concerned about using the military on the street, but they haven't done anything to actually try to revoke and change his legal authority to be able to do so if he was elected president. And again, the only reason the Insurrection Act exists is it was the culmination of several quote-unquote militia acts, which were first brought forward in the 1790s. Why? Because the Battle of Wabash, where the United States was massively defeated, by the way, by the Western Confederacy of Native Americans. And they said, wow, we got to get our military together so we can kill more of these Native Americans and control this territory. And then it further developed when they realized in the post-revolutionary period that some, you know, poor middle farmers, different people like that, might rise up against taxes and things that they felt were unjust, like Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. And so they said, we even have to even more force to be able to put down poor people. So putting down poor people and Indians is where this is rooted, but you can't hear one word about it from Kamala Harris. But allegedly, Trump, we're not supposed to talk about that. But I think the point you're making is 100% correct, is that we cannot eliminate our agency. I mean, you know, you made the point there about 2020, and we could say sort of really the whole country. I mean, obviously, the history of policing in the United States of America is a big part of the sort of authoritarian, semi-fascist, fascist, whatever you want to call it, history of the country. I mean, the first most organized police forces are in cities like Charleston and Richmond, Virginia, and they're 100% designed to suppress all Black people and make sure that there could be no slave rebellions. And up to the present day, I mean, every Black person in America knows that you can be executed on the street by the cops at any time for any reason, and no one will ever be held responsible, right? Like, that is a known fact. But the sort of general authority of policing over how we address issues of community violence and so on and so forth was at least briefly disrupted in 2020 because of this huge mass movement. And it was so huge that every institution in the United States felt that they had to at least fake that they were in favor of the movement, from the NFL, which is run by a bunch of, wild right-wing billionaires who not only love the police, but many of them love Trump, to most of the Democratic Party politicians doing the dumb knee-taking thing, to Pepsi doing that stupid commercial with Kendall Jenner. I mean, all of it may be surface level, but it shows you how powerful it was that the most powerful people in the country said, I would rather people think we're with them than get that smoke if they think that we are against them. And I think when we look at what Trump is saying now, this is critically important because, look, if they're saying we're going to deport 12 to 15 million people, well, I feel very strongly, and I am a documented person. I'm a citizen of the United States, and I know undocumented people. I know people who are in precarious situations, and I feel very strongly they should not be removed from this country. So if every just one person of the 12 million, if every one of them has one person who feels the same way, well, that's 24 million people combined. Now, if 24 million people say, well, you know what? You want to deport people, but we're not going to just stand by. And when you come to people's houses, we're going to come out of our house and we're going to do civil disobedience. So if ICE is going to arrest my neighbor, you got to arrest me too. You're going to throw them over the border, you got to throw me over the border with them. Honestly, they're not going to be able to deport 12 million people in that context. They're just not. And so ultimately, as we've learned, you could, and there's so many historical examples, of course, the Battle of Cable Street, in the UK and London, which really stopped the rising fascist forces under Mosley and others, that quite frankly, the things that have been most effective in fighting fascism are people willing to confront fascists directly on multiple different levels when they try to rise. And I think that is a really crucially important factor. It's the same thing with the civil rights movement. I mean, it was not Kennedy and Johnson that pushed back the sort of revanchist attempt of the Ku Klux Klan to prevent any changes in civil rights acts. It was the acts of heroism by primarily black people, but also people of all races who stood with them, many of whom were also killed, to stand up for the rights of people to have, the most basic human rights, and to demand that the government restrict the ability of these extra legal lynch mobs to act in the way that they had for hundreds of years. So again and again and again, we see that really it's an organized, mobilized people with a strong ideological agenda that not only can confront fascists, but also can present a counter vision to the people the fascists are trying to appeal to about how to resolve the problems that they are actually facing, so they don't become manipulated to build a powerful movement that can push back. That is what has pushed back the far right, fascist and otherwise, historically and contemporarily. And it's the Democrats who are doing everything they possibly can to prevent people from building strong, powerful movements that can confront the far right, because they know they won't be able to control that. The Democratic wing of the billionaire class won't be able to control that. And so ultimately, for them, better to ape the fascist, like Kamala Harris talking about, he didn't build the wall and we're going to be the worst, we're going to be the best, deporters, we're going to get rid of all these people, all these other things, I mean, I'm not saying that people should victimize themselves, to allow themselves to be victimized, but even though if you come into my house, you're going to get shot. I mean, all of it speaking to this sort of, the whole rhetoric, of it, right? I mean, like, that's the average American gun owner, right, is not a hunter, even though that's how it's presented in the political sphere. It's, basically racist in the suburbs who are worried black and Latino people are going to break into their house, right? So aping that kind of language about using firearms in order to suppress poor people of color as a legitimate factor. I mean, her longtime praise for jailing people over truancy. I mean, the Democrats would rather ape these far-right authoritarian points that have shifted the political agenda further to the right, that has ultimately actually been a factor in empowering the fascist forces. Really, truly, has been a factor in empowering the fascist force. They would rather do that than create a strong progressive political bloc that the majority of the country would probably support to isolate and marginalize the far right. Because at the end of the day, the further right you go, fine for capitalism, because it's just capitalism. Moving to the right just means going to a purer and purer form of capitalist rule. The further to the left you go, the more you're actually challenging the prerogatives of capitalists. And the capitalists pay the bills at the Democratic Party. They keep the lights on. They fund the revolving door, all these other things. These politicians, these DC people, they're never going to change. And they would rather have a far right potentially sliding even deeper in a fascist direction type of government than have, say, Bernie Sanders.
Indeed. And, how else can Democrats justify loving Dick Cheney or Liz Cheney or George W. Bush? I mean, there was nobody more hated by Democrats in the base of the Democratic Party than Bush and Cheney, because 1 million plus people died in Iraq. That was a key thing. Thousands of Muslims were rounded up after September 11th. Guantanamo, a permanent torture center. I mean, and now people say, well, you're not Donald Trump. You're in fact against Donald Trump. In the case of Cheney, you're for Kamala Harris, so we like you. We have a united front with you. That's the thing about the Democratic so-called center and the so-called liberal wing, which doesn't hardly exist. But they prefer a united front with the right-wing reactionary forces as opposed to actually supporting working class people and the struggle of oppressed communities and oppressed nations to fight for freedom and liberation. You can see it in the Palestine protests. I mean, who's suppressing the Palestine protests right now? Well, all these sort of terrible draconian measures against college students who dared to think that they lived in an environment of academic freedom and that they could pitch a tent against genocide, and the repression is coming against them. Well, that's not Trump. This is the Biden-Harris administration. Anyway, I think I want to have you comment on that, but then I want to go to the bigger picture, Eugene, of what MAGA means. What does make America great again? And then you have these some weird small groups on the left who say that they're going to be MAGA communists, or like MAGA has become a thing. Make America great again, right-wingers. Make America great again, centrists. Make America great again, leftists. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to make America great again? And I want to have your thoughts about that, and I want to add my own thoughts to it, because I think it goes to the heart of what Trump is really doing. If you went around and stopped the people who were coming to the Madison Square Garden rally a couple days ago and said, by the way, when was America great? What years are you talking about? Well, maybe they'd say, well, 2017 to 21 when Trump was president. Okay, but the slogan existed then, make America great again. What was the again? What time period were we talking about? I mean, it speaks to what this movement really is, because yes, it's partly a fantasy, but there was another time in America when for black people, the conditions of life were really the same as any fascist country, and not for 5 years or 6 years or 10 years like as existed under Hitler in Germany, but I'm talking about centuries. Anyway, go ahead.
I think that's a great point, and I think it's multifold in terms of the appeal. I think in a way, if you look at Trump's appeal, and this is an important factor, I think, because the so-called media in this country, the liberal media, says that Trump's supporters are the working class. And of course, many of his supporters are the working class, because the majority of people in the United States are in the working class, like hundreds of millions of people. But when you really look at the actual polling and the actual elections, and this is true even before Trump, sort of the lower your salary is, the less likely you are to vote for Republicans. And Trump, in terms of his support in the working class, I think does the best, I know when you look at the polls, between people making between like $75,000 and $200,000, which includes, certain workers who are working in the crafts. It includes a lot of people who are small business owners, different people like that. People who the historical basis for when they thought things might be great is related to the times that those elements and stratas of the working class were the most empowered. Primarily, I think, the sort of post-World War II reality, and I think that's the nature of the cultural politics of Trump, right? Like, well, when were things like a lot better? Like when was the, if you made a decent salary, you could, and I'm raising this not to hate on people making $75,000 to $250,000. I'm actually raising it because even though those are good salaries, a very significant number of people making that much money nowadays are kind of struggling, to have good housing, good childcare. Like, you actually have a good job and you still are kind of on the fence, right? Like, that's where we are in the United States now. So you're thinking, well, when was it when you had a good job, you weren't really kind of on the fence cost of living wise? And you think the 50s because, hey, my grandparents maybe a good factory job, although we know there's a lot of mythology about that too, right? Like how people's bodies were totally destroyed in these factories, and so on and so forth. But that kind of white picket fence, suburbs, blah, blah, blah kind of reality, I think is what Trump is trying to draw people to, and people who have cultural connections because of where they live in the country and the nature of the economy there, have some sort of memory of, or can talk to someone who has a memory of. And then you sort of do the Occam's razor thing, and it's like, well, what was different about then and now? And of course, gay people, the whole LGBTQ community completely in the closet, black people under Jim Crow, women in the home. And so, Trump and the movement pick up on all these themes because it sort of helps draw you like, oh yeah, that's a good point. It did seem like things were better back when that was the case. And maybe I did lose something because of civil rights, because of women's rights, because of the gay liberation movement. Like, maybe it is us against them. And I think that Trump is trying to draw people to that history and that reality, which in and of itself is sort of fake and constructed in a fake way, but it sort of speaks to the kind of grievance politics that he's trying to mobilize. But I think there's a second element to it. Like, why is it, I saw in the Financial Times relatively recently, a major hedge fund person told them that they felt that Hillary Clinton had like 80% of the people on Wall Street supporting her in 2016. Kamala Harris has like 55%. That Trump has gotten a lot more popular amongst like the hedge fund corporate elites since 2016. Like, why might that be? Well, because Trump is also saying, make America great again to them. And when they're thinking about that, they're thinking, okay, every single thing that prevents us from making as many profits as we want, Trump wants to get rid of. Environmental regulations, get rid of them. Workers' rights regulations, get rid of them. Unions, smash them. Even he's talking about going back before the income tax. You know what I mean? Like before the progressive era, right? That the muckrakers revealed all these things that led to the first, sort of regulations on industry in some ways. So if you're like a really rich capitalist, that sounds great. I mean, he did the thing with Elon Musk. And of course, that he said, Elon, I love how you deal with unions. I love how they strike and you just bust them up, And Elon kind of chuckles, doesn't really even say all that much because I think he knew he could get in trouble legally for that. But that being said, you could see why Elon Musk or these other people would be like, Trump, he's rude, he's crude. Some of what he's saying, maybe I don't really love it. But at the end of the day, he's talking about when we were really great. The robber baron era, right? Like when the richest of the rich were really great, when they really ran everything with no intercession whatsoever from any government authority, no rights for workers, no rights for women, no rights for blacks. That sounds great to us. Look at all the stuff around us. The Carnegie castles, the Heinz Chapel in Pittsburgh, the Standard Oil wealth and everything that was able to do, the Hearst Castle there in California. Like you look at that, and I'm not saying people aren't living good now, because they're living good now. But I think that golden age of capitalist robber barons is the other Make America Great Again. So you've got Trump mobilizing both sort of the appeal to kind of racist, patriarchal, anti-gay 1950s politics for the sort of upper strata of the working class who can remember that their grandparents used to have a job at U.S. Steel and it seemed like it was a good job. And then he's also mobilizing the richest of the rich around reminding them, hey, there used to be a time when you didn't have to listen to all of these, people who you find annoying, like black women who demand a place on your board, because how dare you have a black woman say I deserve to have the same rights as a white man at the top of this system? Like, how ridiculous is that? Well, we're going to make sure we get rid of DEI so you never have to listen to any of them. And we're going to get rid of affirmative action so their kids don't have to go to your college. We're bringing it all back like it was 1905.
There was a period of massive mobilization, a grassroots movement, I would call a revolution of a certain type, the civil rights revolution. You can sort of, for people who are younger now, who need a historical marker, use 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, and then say till 1970, when you have SNCC and the Panthers being basically exterminated, not completely, but, violently repressed, murdered by J. Edgar Hoover, FBI, terrible repression at the end of the 60s against the Black liberation movement. It's not the only reason the movement contracted, but it was an important part of it. So you have 1955 to 1970, you have this massive change in America. I would say it's, in a way, a cultural revolution, but it wasn't just cultural. It also associated with political rights, social rights, economic rights. There was a change, a big change. You had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. After this ascendancy of the struggle of Black America, joined by many allies and supporters from other people, including white people, young white people who were inspired, of course, Latino people especially, Asian Americans. But there was this upsurge. And so we had an expansion of democracy. And I think when this slogan, Make America Great Again, one of the sort of the dog whistle elements of this is we want to go back to before that period. And now, in a way, it will never go back before that period because Black America lived under police state conditions, fascist conditions, in many parts of the country, big parts of the country, and even in the parts of the country where, say, in the Chicago suburbs, where it wasn't a fascist police state like Alabama, the same reign of terror existed. I mean, all those sundown towns in America where black people, after sundown, if you were there, you were going to get killed or badly hurt. There are thousands of them, in fact, north and south. So I think the Make America Great Again movement is telling these capitalists and this broader part of the population that it's kind of sort of using this mythology about this earlier great period. It's to try to end the Cultural Revolution, end the social economic changes that took place. Partly from the labor movement, as you said, but very historically, I would say most significantly from the uprising of Black America. But the right wing can't make it a frontal assault against Black America because Black America is just not going to go back. It's too strong, too many people. It's not going to happen. So the focus, I think, is on immigrants. The focus is on transgender kids. The focus now, as Trump is ranting, calling Anderson Cooper, Allison Cooper, against gay people, generally speaking. It's got these secondary targets, but the real goal is to undo the progressive social change that came about from the civil rights revolution. I want to play an audio, it's a video clip, and for our podcast listeners, an audio clip. It's from Trump in different places. One is where he's talking about immigrant people as animals. And then there's another clip, the so-called comedian who Trump brought to the stage, who's calling Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Again, these are becoming like noteworthy elements, but I think it's in a way masks what the real enemy of the MAGA movement in Trump is. Anyway, let's start with this clip from Trump talking about undocumented workers as animals.
An illegal alien animal. The Democrats say, please don't call them animals. They're humans. I said, no, they're not humans. They're not humans. They're animals. And Nancy Pelosi told me that. She said, please don't use the word animal, sir, when you're talking about these people. I said, I'll use the word animal because that's what they are.
Eugene, this kind of scapegoating, in one way, it's like Nazism, the way Hitler scapegoated Jewish people, scapegoated Roma people, scapegoated gay people, scapegoated East European immigrants who were living in Germany at the time. The scapegoating is emblematic of a kind of fascist approach, I'd say. But at the same time, it conceals the problem that the MAGA movement has, which is they can't attack the real target, which is Black America, which, as you have said in the past, has always been the detonator for social progress.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think, it's something that people lose about the civil rights movement, the Southern freedom movement, and the different elements of it is understanding the relationship of what communists have historically called national oppression, what others would call racism, white supremacy of Black people in America, but how intrinsic it was to capitalism, because the establishment of the Solid South, starting in slavery and then continuing after a brief interregnum there during Reconstruction into redemption and into Jim Crow, was not just about keeping Black people down or even just about keeping the Southern plantation owners rich. It was also about creating a reactionary political bloc that could keep the country itself moving, in a very right-wing direction, because the same people who were in favor of Jim Crow were the same people who were against unions, the same people who were the most rabid anti-communists, the same who were actually very open, oftentimes anti-Semites, against Catholics, a very kind of, fascist type of ideological reality, right? And so the ability to have these, totally undemocratic people who could stay there for forever, who then got seniority in Congress, which meant they got control over important committees, meant that you had this reactionary, right-wing, pro-capitalist political bloc that was going to protect the interests and prerogatives of capital. Now, once you had the breakdown of that reactionary political bloc, both during Reconstruction and then again during the Civil Rights Movement, then you started to open up a vast range of new possibility in terms of legislation. I mean, this is why you have at the same time of the Civil Rights Movement, the emergence of the Consumer consumer rights movement, because you were challenging not just the issue of Jim Crow, you were actually challenging the power structure in America and disrupting the mechanisms by which they were exercising their power legislatively. I mean, it's notable when you look at the Powell Amendment that was written in 1971 by soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, that was saying that the country was basically being lost to capitalism, and that capitalists, the so-called free enterprise system, had to start fighting back. It's sort of amazing when you read down through it because it's so bombastic, and he gets to like the person he says is the worst person out there, the sign that America is like in decline and the free enterprise system is being destroyed. And I'm thinking, I don't know who he's going to say. And he says, Ralph Nader. And it just shocks me because I'm like, so seat belts in cars? But it gives you a sense of their mentality. And that's what the civil rights movement really kicked off and disrupted. By disrupting the ability of the capitalist and the center-right, right-wing capitalist forces to do things like restrict putting seat belts in cars because they now no longer have the strict political control of the Solid South, they really started to lose control of what was really going on. And I think they haven't really been able to get it back fully since then. You had Nixon tried to put in the Southern strategy. You know, you had Reagan come in with something similar. You had Clinton try to undermine the black community with welfare reform. But there hasn't been as stable of a pro-capitalist kind of base. That's why they're switching around different ways, looking for different things. Maybe it's the New Democrats this time. Maybe it's the Reaganites that time. Maybe it's Bush this time. Now it's Trump in different spaces because they had such a good system for 500 years by having this fascist dictatorship in the South. It was working so well for them in so many ways. And they haven't fully been able to find something as stable in that regard. And so that, I think, is why they're targeting the civil rights era. I think you're right about that. And that sort of period of time and the sort of social and cultural changes that came at that moment, because the undermining of this 500-year system of legislative control that they were able to push this reactionary agenda, had made it so difficult for them to continue to push forward, which is why you have a similar reality now where they're saying like, okay, we want to restore that pre-agenda, but as you say, this was such a profound change in the country. It unleashed so many, I mean, you talk about immigration as an issue, the 1965 Immigration Act that, of course, started to open the country back up to immigrants coming from other countries, would not have happened without the civil rights movement. The expansion of the the creation and expansion of the Department of Education, Title I schools, the support for colleges and universities, the rise of affirmative action, the Community Reinvestment Act. And I don't mean this in any way, shape, or form to disrespect anyone, but that's also why many immigrant communities who came after 1965 were also able to succeed in the United States because of the changes that the civil rights movement made to the racist reaction and reality of the banks and the capital it made available by reallocating it from taxes on the wealthy. So you really have not just a cultural revolution, but a social and economic moment that the capitalists, I personally feel, have not fully recovered from. They don't fully know how to keep the lid on the pot in a sustainable way. So they're trying to go back to the old ways a little bit, but they understand that to attack the black community directly, as you pointed out, actually then reveals to people what this is really about. Because then we have to have the conversation like the one we're talking about now. Like it wasn't just about the lunch counter, but all the other things that came with the lunch counter that were tremendously empowering basically to all people in the country, certainly anyone who is black, absolutely many people who are poor as well, who gained from the Great Society programs that were only possible because of what took place in civil rights, which clearing the way for the Great Society to come forward. And then you start to think, okay, well, wait a second. The type of politics that we actually need to fight back is not the type of politics that's being offered by the so-called liberal, progressive side of things now. And again, it starts to undermine them in a major way. And of course, for the right wing, it provokes too much of a pushback and a fight back. And that's why they're trying all these different various ways of trying to get in through the back door in a way they can't come in through the front door. But I think it's a really important point, and it's a really important marker for how we look at our society. And it's an important marker for capitalism. And I'll just end on this, because this is the same period that the rate of profitability start to significantly decline in capitalism, and it's still declining today. And so you can see at the same time, sort of working and oppressed people are starting to exercise their political power in ways they had not been able to for the whole 500 years, basically, of America in any significant way. When you've broken up the traditional legislative cartel that is keeping the most reactionary section of the ruling class riding high in the saddle, and when you can see that, for every dollar you put in, you're getting less and less out, for the capitalist class, this means a crisis. And if they want to roll back that crisis, they have to not just attack the working class in a general sense, but attack the social and economic gains that they were able to make in their various movements that were really culminated in so many ways by the civil rights movement, which, by the way, got a lot of support from the labor movement.
So 1964 was the Civil Rights Act. By the way, this speaks, I think, exactly to the topic we're talking about. The demographic makeup of the U.S. Congress in 1964 was the same as it was in 1954. So the year before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man and was arrested, and that triggered the Montgomery bus boycott and started the civil rights revolution in earnest. The Congress that upheld that system of apartheid was demographically the same as the one that passed the historic 64 Civil Rights Act 10 years later. So what happened in those 10 years? Congress did not change. It was the same white, racist, Dixiecrat-dominated Congress. Anybody can go back and do this research. This is not rhetoric on my part. Look it up. This is the same Congress. Many of them are just the same incumbents over and over and over again. So what changed in those 10 years? It wasn't Congress. It wasn't the politicians. It wasn't the Democrats. The people changed. The people became political actors. The people became active in the movement. They considered themselves radical and revolutionary people, and they made the change. And it was so dominant, so powerful that the bourgeoisie, in spite of itself, in spite of all the kicking and screaming, it had to say yes finally instead of constantly saying no. So it's such an important point to remember as we enter the next era, whatever it is, even if Trump wins. Like, if you want to defeat the right, that's how you defeat the right.
Yeah.
Okay, in 1965, Eugene, I want to flag this because you mentioned it, and I want our audience to really also do their own research on this. In addition to the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65, there was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, what you talked about, the immigration reform. Well, what did that immigration reform do? Asian people, Chinese people were excluded. They could not come here. The U.S. immigration policy was based on race and ethnicity. That was the reality of America. You said it was America's bourgeois democracy and American fascism not only went together, they intersect. They weren't just parallel realities. They were bound together. There's a book that I want to encourage people to read. It's this book. People can take a look. Hitler's American Model. When the Nazis were brought to power by the bourgeoisie in 1933, they wanted to change citizen requirements so they could make Jews in Germany second-class citizens. They wanted to know how to do it. They looked to America. They came to the United States and said, well, we want to do to the Jews in Germany what you guys, the American bourgeoisie, have done for centuries, or certainly since 1887, to black America. Eventually, the Nazi policy evolves into a full-out genocide. But in the beginning, they were like, let's look to America. America is our model. Read that book. The author's name is James Whitman. I'm encouraging our audience, read the book. Get the book for yourself. All right. With that said, Eugene, I want to get to our final point. We talked about 2020, how the masses of people rose up against Trump's effort to use the military against American cities, that pushed it back. Then let's put the video forward to January 6th. And we have some footage of January 6th. Trump loses the election narrowly. He breaks the cardinal rule of bourgeois politics, which is to accept the peaceful transfer of power from the Democrats to the Republicans and vice versa. This is used by the capitalists, by the imperialists, to show that America is really stable. Win or lose, all the ruling class parties They're not going to engage in civil war in order to protect their position. They're going to say the capitalist system as it exists dominates. Well, Trump obviously didn't care about that rule. And the mob that sort of dispersed the U.S. Congress, they dispersed the U.S. Congress. They couldn't certify the election for hours. I mean, the Capitol building taken over by armed, gun-toting mob. And you would think, well, that's the end of Trump. The Democrats, having had this thing come to an end, they can certainly have him arrested for sedition. The U.S. military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sent a letter to all 1.3 million members of the U.S. military saying that was sedition. If you engage in that, you're going to be arrested. But here we are 4 years later, Eugene. The Democrats have allowed Trump to come back. The Democrats are not, if you think Trump is an odious, right-wing, racist, misogynist pig, but if you don't like him, don't think the Democrats are going to be your savior or salvation, because we don't have to look to 100 years ago or 50 years ago. We can look to the last 5 years and see how the Democrats have allowed, and in fact, their policies have been conducive to the rise of Trump once again. Anyway, with that, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, well, I think you make a number of different points. And just to quickly jump back, I mean, not only the point you made about the Congress in terms of the Civil Rights Act, let's remember Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a big supporter of Japanese internment and the policies where Japanese people couldn't own land and different things when he was Attorney General and Governor of California. So, the fact that that guy also passed Brown versus the Board of Education gives you a sense of how powerful social movements can really change things, and the fear of communism, too, by the way, because of how civil rights was being used by the Soviet Union and others around the world. But yeah, to your point, I think it's correct. I mean, I already mentioned it once, but the Democrats are, well, let me actually start here. What is Trump really taking advantage of? I mean, the things that Trump is appealing to are the contradictions that exist within the system. The destruction of, the mass production industrial industries in the upper Midwest, the New England, and also elements of the West. The massive wars that have been waged all across West Asia and other parts of the world that have killed so many people and here at home. The immigration issue, which is basically caused by the unchecked policies of NAFTA, the WTO, the destruction of so many different economies around the world, the wars that have happened as a result of it, and the encroachments of climate change that are making it difficult for people to survive in many parts of the world. So if you don't actually address any of those issues, the types of forces that will allow Trump to continue to rise will continue. I mean, you look at Trump right now, doing this whole thing about, and all of them, they're talking about all these people coming from Venezuela. They're taking over apartment buildings. Now, a lot of that seems to be fake, so let's also just say that. But to the extent a lot of people have come from Venezuela to the United States, that is because the United States put sanctions on Venezuela, which destroyed its economy, which made it really, people had no choice but to try to leave because it's difficult for them to survive. The same thing could be said about Cuba. The same thing could certainly also can also be said about Haiti, which the United States, under the leadership of Trump's great friend, Marco Rubio, has, and many others, but I'm just talking about the past 5 or 6 years here, gone out of its way to make sure that Haiti can't get up off the mat and that its economy is just a total neo-colonial disaster where people are forced to flee the country to many places, including the United States. So the Democrats are supporting the sanctions on Venezuela. They were actually, sort of previewed by Obama, put in more heavily by Trump, and then doubled down on by Biden. They're continuing the blockade of Cuba, which, again, Trump and Biden, same basic position. To the extent they even talk about Haiti publicly, they're doing exactly the same thing. But it's really, honestly, even worse than that, the installation of this fake transitional government. So none of these, and they're not dealing with climate change in a way that's actually going to change anything. I mean, I think every single person, you should just Google it and just look at where the sort of Biden-Harris target is and look where we need to be by 2030. And you'll see that the Democrats are doing nothing serious about that at all. They're continuing the so-called pivot to Asia and the new Cold War with China. The Democrats want to double down on the war in Ukraine. At least that's what they say. They are uncritically supporting a genocide in Gaza and supporting the expansion of the war into multiple different countries, including Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and and Iran. So all of the major issues, oh, sorry, I left one out here. They also aren't even really doing anything to address the decline of the manufacturing economy. Because when you actually look at their plan and they say, this is, I'm Biden, I'm working class Joe, I'm this, that, and the third, and Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, we're bringing it all back. Well, at the end of the day, the best case scenario for the amount of jobs that those two acts are going to create would mean manufacturing employment still remains below 10%, still actually remains as a percentage of the workforce in single digits. And the type of policies that could revive it, which would be mass expansion of public transit, housing, different pieces like that, nowhere on the Democratic Party agenda. So when you look at the issues that are the most motivating for Trump's rise, you can see the Democrats are doing absolutely nothing to arrest the negative trends. They're speaking to the problem, but they aren't promoting solutions that speak to the scale of the problem, and thus it's only going to get worse. And in fact, those forces are only going to get stronger. And as much as people think, oh, Kamala, if she wins, is going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, people should think about this. And we go back to the beginning of our conversation about how aping the right wing in Germany was what helped shift the political agenda further to the right because the contradictions weren't being resolved, which helped Hitler become even more popular. Well, if Kamala wins, it'll probably be close, which means that all these other people in the right wing are going to say the election was stolen. Now, whether or not they can stop her from getting in, I really don't know. I don't think they can. But what is the implication about a even larger number of people saying that elections don't matter at all, that the Democrats have stolen the last two elections? They're part of a movement that is based on extreme sort of racist, grievance-based, violent approaches to how to address social problems. In a context where, by the way, Nazis are having a great year, sadly, because they've been trying to manipulate ridiculously the anger around the genocide and try to convince people it's about Jews, not about Zionism and imperialism. And we have to remember that too. Those groups are growing as well. That these people are going to come together and in a strong fascist movement in the same way they are. They're going to be fueled by the exact same issues. And this time, though, they're not going to be thinking who the president's going to be in 2028. They're going to be thinking about how they storm the gates and impose what they want. And we know that there's billionaires like Peter Thiel who are already talking about this, the so-called network state movement already talking about this, how to actually take advantage of these grievance politics to end democracy, like the real Hitler admires, not the wannabes like Trump who makes his little comments or whatever, but he doesn't know what he's saying from one second to the next. Those people will grow because Kamala's agenda is not going to address any of the actual undercurrents that have been driving their growth so far and that will continue to drive their growth moving forward. So from my point of view, for people who do take this seriously, and every single person who considers himself in favor of, higher wages, civil rights, human rights for all people, the right of women to control their own bodies, all of the ending the wars abroad, ending the sanctions. Like if you are for a better life for just average everyday people, you should be taking this seriously because they're coming for you at every level, these far right forces. They're not quite taking it to fascism, but they're coming for you right now. If we don't build a strong alternative that can speak to the country, when you have 69% of people in the country saying they want to see major changes to the economy or have it totally torn down, well, if there's no place for that energy to go, then quite frankly, the fascist forces will succeed. So unless we start to build a real alternative that have solutions that meet the scale of the problem, that's not just at the ballot box, but that is also in the streets and everywhere else we have to be to affect the political agenda of the country, we will not succeed. And voting for the Democrats, they do not want that. They have not been able to arrest the rise of the far right in the past 40 years. They will not be able to do it in the next 40 years. They do not want a strong, powerful mass movement on the streets that can challenge their stranglehold over progressive people in this country, bourgeois liberal hegemony. They will not do it. If you vote for them in November, you will be just continuing the downward slide. At a certain point, just like the abolitionists in the Liberty Party in the 1840s, who were just as ridiculed as every third party in America today, you have to step out and build something different. There's no alternative to that, and history proves it. But sadly, we have a media that is captured, ignorant, illiterate, and is not able to explain this to anyone, which is why we're happy to be here on Breakthrough News.
Indeed, and that's the point. All of this analysis, all of our assessment, our perspective, it's not because it's, quote, interesting. This is a guide for a path forward. We're building a mass movement. The movement needs ideas. It needs political thought. It needs action. It needs unity. It needs to build alliances. Most importantly, it needs to know where it's going. And going with the Democratic Party is straight into the graveyard for progressive social movement. So our movement must be and will be independent. Eugene, the next months will be decisive. They'll be significant. I'm expecting that there will be a giant fight back movement. And all of us who are presenting here not only are talking, but we're also activists, we're organizers, and we join people all over the country as we're on the verge of this election. Think beyond Tuesday, think about and will be thinking about and building a mass movement. Eugene Puryear, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.